Duties to employers has three standards: loyalty, additional compensation arrangements, and responsibilities of supervisors. Before we go into the details of these standards, let's just take a step back and understand where duties to employers fits in the context of the seven standards. If you recall, the first standard is professionalism, the second standard is integrity of capital markets, the third was duties to clients, and after duties to clients comes duties to employers. This position in the seven standards is important. What this is saying is that for you as a member or candidate, integrity of capital markets is extremely important. After that comes duties to clients, and only after duties to clients comes your duty to the employer. The duty to the employer comes above your own self-interest. We'll discuss this in more detail shortly. Standard 4A, loyalty. In matters related to their employment, members and candidates must act for the benefit of their employer and not deprive their employer of the advantage of their skills and abilities, divulge confidential information, or otherwise cause harm to their employer. Let us start here by putting loyalty in context. Say you work for an investment management firm and you have committed to work 45 hours a week. In those 45 hours, you need to give your entire skills and abilities to the employer. And you should not do anything that will hurt the employer, in the sense that you should not divulge confidential information or otherwise cause harm to your employer. Taking this one step further, let's say you are trading using your employer's account and you are about to place a very large buy order. You are tempted then to place an order for the same stock using your own personal account before placing the trade using your employer's account. This is something called front running, and it is strictly unethical. This would also be a violation of standard 4A. So when you place trades, you should place trades for your employer first, and after that, with the permission of the employer, you can place trades for your own account. This would be an example of loyalty. Loyalty, however, doesn't mean that in all matters the interest of the employer comes first, and I'm going to quote from the curriculum here. This standard does not mean that there is a blanket requirement to place the employer interest ahead of your own interests in all matters. For example, if you have important personal and family obligations, those should not be compromised because of your employment. And what you need to do is engage in a dialogue with your employer to make sure that you are contributing and giving everything that you have committed to give to the employer in terms of your skills and abilities, and say 45 hours a week. But then after that, you also need to take care of your personal commitments. Coming now to the guidance. Just like you have responsibilities towards the employer also has responsibilities. An important responsibility is that the client should not have any policies, procedures, rules, both written or unstated, which encourage any form of unethical behavior. If there is such a situation, then you need to encourage your employer to change those rules or practices. Next one is important and testable independent practice. Let's say you work for a particular company and are thinking of starting an independent practice. So perhaps you are thinking of working late nights or the weekend, and you want to do something which might possibly conflict with what you are doing at your employer. If you are thinking of something like this, Before starting, you must get written permission from your employer. When getting permission, you must clearly specify what sort of services you are planning to offer, what sort of compensation you expect to receive, how long the service will be for, and so on. This way, your company can determine whether there is any possible conflict of interest. And finally, you should only start this independent practice if you get approval from your company. Another important point has to do with leaving an employer. Let's say that you have decided to leave your employer and you have given your employer a 1-month notice. So this is your notice period. Here you submitted your resignation, gave a 1-month notice period, and this is your end date. So once you've decided to leave, what behavior is acceptable and what is not acceptable? The larger point is that during this time, you must continue to act in the best interest of your employer. You cannot take any trade secrets and reveal them to your next employer. You cannot start making a list of customers, potential clients, or any other proprietary information. You should not be telling the clients of this employer to give you business at your next job. So anything that in any way will hurt your current employer should not be done. Once you have left your employment and you are paid by the next employer, then you can potentially go and seek business from the clients of this particular company, as long as you did not sign a non-compete clause. If you did sign a non-compete clause with this company for, let's say, 3 years, then you need to follow the terms stated in that particular agreement. So what is it that is acceptable to take to your next employer? Any skills or any knowledge that you have gained that you can take over. For example, if during this job you learned how to do financial modeling, so that is a skill and it's based on knowledge that you can take over. On the other hand, if you actually developed specific models, let's say for the pharmaceutical industry, and these models are based on Excel, you cannot take those Excel models over to the next employer. The reason is that you created these models for your original employer, and your original employer paid you for that work. So you cannot take that information over. Next point has to do with the use of social media. The major point here is that if your employer has any rules and guidelines related to the use of social media, you need to follow those rules. If the employer does not have any defined rules related to social media, then be careful to follow the spirit of this standard and not do anything over social media that would in any way harm your employer. Next point related to whistleblowing is also extremely important and testable. If you recall, I talked earlier about the fact that the integrity of capital markets comes first in terms of your loyalties. After integrity of capital markets comes your duty to clients, then comes the duty to your employer. Let's say you are in a situation where your employer or somebody at your company is either violating standard 2, which is integrity of capital markets, or let's say that something is being done that hurts the best interests of the clients. Then what do you do? In that case, it is acceptable to raise the matter with law enforcement authorities, and that is whistleblowing. Note the sports analogy here. Just like when a referee sees a foul play, the referee blows a whistle. Similarly, if you in an investment management context see something that should not be happening, then you blow the whistle in the sense that you might potentially be speaking with the law enforcement authorities. Now, whistleblowing is important as long as you are doing it for the best interest of the industry or capital markets or for the best interest of your clients. Under Standard 4A, whistleblowing is not acceptable if you are looking for your own best interest. Let's say that your employer has not acted appropriately with you and, despite several promises, has not paid you for the last several months. In that case, Standard 4A does not allow you to engage in whistleblowing. Nature of employment. The point here is fairly straightforward. You need to understand the nature of your employment. You might be employed as an independent contractor, or you might be employed as a full-time employee. You need to understand your role. You need to understand the terms and conditions associated with your employment, and you need to follow those terms and conditions. Recommended procedures for compliance. These connect with what we've just been talking about. Competition policy connects with independent practice in the sense that your company might have documented rules and procedures about any sort of independent practice that an employee might want to set up. Make sure that you understand the policy, that you understand the rules, and that you follow them. Next is termination policy. Your company might have rules about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable once you decide to leave the company. Make sure you know the policy and that you follow it. Incident reporting procedures connects with whistleblowing. Your company might have rules, regulations, and procedures about what to do when you see something wrong happening at your company. Again, you need to understand those rules and follow them. Let's say that your company does not have any incident reporting procedures. Then you should encourage them to set up such procedures which are in line with best practices in the industry. And finally, employee classification connects with nature of employment. A company might have different types of employees, full-time employees, part-time employees, contractors, and so on. You need to understand where you fit, and you need to follow the rules and the terms associated with your job. Standard 4B, additional compensation arrangements. Members and candidates must not accept gifts, benefits, compensation, or consideration that competes with or might reasonably be expected to create a conflict of interest with their employer's interest unless they obtain written consent from all parties involved. Let us first understand the context of this particular standard. Say you work at a company. This is an investment management company, and let's say that you are a portfolio manager. Earlier, we talked about the concept of an independent practice, where you were thinking of starting up something independently over the weekend. This particular standard, Standard 4B, actually deals with your role in the context of the company. Say that in your role as a portfolio manager, a given client has benefited a lot from your work and is extremely happy with you. This client now wants to send you and your family on a very expensive vacation. So this is the sort of additional compensation arrangement that we are talking about. Another example would be that you use a particular brokerage firm, and this brokerage firm also wants to compensate you so that you keep sending them business. While this is questionable and something that we've discussed as part of some of the other standards, but just to understand, these are the sorts of additional compensation arrangements that are being talked about in Standard 4B. Independent practice was discussed in Standard 4A. Now, let's take the client situation. If the client wants to compensate you, what you must do is obtain permission before accepting compensation, because this compensation might create a conflict. Putting it another way, any compensation that might create a conflict must first be reported to your employer, and the employer then needs to allow you in writing before you can accept the gift. And just understand why this is the case. Your employer might have assigned you to several different clients. If you are accepting expensive gifts from one particular client, then that might compromise your behavior, in the sense that you might then favor this particular client over the other clients who have been assigned to you. And this is for your company to decide. That's why, as long as your company gives you written permission to accept the gift, then it is okay. Now, what does written consent mean? This actually includes any form of communication that can be documented. So as long as you send an email to your boss and he approves, that is acceptable. Another point to note here is that if you receive something, some form of benefit, be it monetary or non-monetary, that is not expected to create a conflict of interest. For that, we do not need to go through this process. The brokerage house that you work with sends you a calendar. Clearly, that's not going to create a conflict of interest, so that doesn't need to be reported. If your client gives you a small token gift, which clearly will not create any conflict of interest, that does not need to be reported either. Another aspect to this discussion has to do with the point where you are in negotiations to start a new job. And a recommended procedure here is that before starting your job or before accepting employment at a new company, you should discuss any possible limitations that you might have. So you might already be engaged in some independent practice. You should discuss that with your future employer. That way, if you want to continue this business and you get written permission upfront, that is obviously good for you, and it's important for your employer to understand any limitations that you have coming into your new role. Recommended procedures for compliance: make an immediate written report to supervisor and compliance officer specifying any compensation you propose to receive. So this is just the formal procedure connected with what we've been talking about. The details of the report should be confirmed by the party offering the additional compensation, including performance incentives offered by clients. This goes back to the simple example where your client is offering you an expensive vacation. When you report to your employer that your client is offering so and so gifts, so to speak, then that report needs to be validated by the client. Otherwise, potentially, you might be understating the level of the compensation that you might be getting from the client. The written report should state the terms of the agreement. So this might not even be a formal agreement, but whatever you are getting from your client should be stated in as much details as possible. So if the vacation is a 3-month vacation to the Bahamas, that can't really be called terms of the agreement, but in a sense, that's the closest that we can get to honoring this particular statement. Responsibilities of supervisors. Members and candidates must make reasonable efforts to ensure that anyone subject to their supervision or authority complies with applicable laws, rules, regulations, and the code and standards. This standard applies to you if you have a supervisory role at your organization. And connecting back with standard 1A, knowledge of the law, there we talked about the laws or the code and standards that apply to you. In other words, you need to follow the strictest interpretation. If you are a supervisor, then those who report to you or your team also then needs to follow the strictest law. So specifically, what is it that you need to do as a supervisor? Number one, you should set up a system for supervision. And what does that mean? You need to ensure that there is a code of ethics or compliance procedures. So all the people who report to you clearly understand what procedures, what rules need to be followed in order to be considered ethical. There need to be adequate compliance procedures. Given the nature of your work, the compliance procedures need to be comprehensive. Simply having the procedures defined is not enough. There needs to be an ongoing education and training system to ensure that people in your organization understand what they need to do, and the necessary rules and procedures are continuously reinforced. And finally, there needs to be an incentive system in order to encourage ethical behaviors. Putting this system in place obviously is important, but despite the fact that you might have the best system in place, there might still be some violations. So you are also responsible for trying to detect possible violations. As a simple example, you might have a procedure in place where periodically you check the trades of all your employees. And what you are trying to ensure there is that employees are not front running, so they are possibly not putting in their own personal transactions ahead of the transactions of the company or the transactions of clients. There might be other possible issues that you might be concerned about, so you need to try and detect those possible issues. If you do find a violation, then you need to obviously research exactly what happened, understand the problem, and take the necessary steps that minimize the probability of that particular problem happening in the future. Simply confronting the employee who did something wrong and telling him not to do this again in the future is not enough. Or just telling the compliance officer or your supervisor of something that didn't happen right and leaving it at that would not be consistent with Standard 4C. You have to take the necessary actions such that chances of those sorts of issues happening in the future are as low as possible. That is it in terms of Standard 4C. And as I keep saying, you need to work through all the examples in the curriculum to properly understand how these standards need to be applied.